Hi, this is Jim Peters on Peters Principles, and as you know, you never know who you're going to have on Peters Principles. And today we have Alexandra Chandler, who's running for Congress in the 3rd Congressional District. I keep wanting to say 5th because when my brother-in-law was in it, it was the 5th Congressional District, but I have to change. So, Alexandra, what makes you want to run for Congress?
Well, first, thank you very much for having me here. I'll say, for me, it's answering a call to serve. I'm someone who believes that I'm the best candidate to actually get things done for working middle-class people in Congress. And the reason for that is I came out of the intelligence community. I spent 13 years dealing with some of the toughest problems on the planet. WMD proliferation, arms smuggling to terrorist groups in war zones. Yelling, inaction, political posturing was not an option. So I had to work with conservative Republicans, liberal Democrats, everyone in between, because politics had no place with problems of that size. So I'll take that pragmatic attitude to Congress. But then it's also, I have specific expertise in national security that no one else in the race has, specific expertise in healthcare. I've been the director of the community health center, and I have lived the working middle class challenges of the district. I had a dad who struggled with unemployment and underemployment from the time he lost a job at 10 to when he died when I was 17. Diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, struggled with addiction, including to prescription drugs. And now, as a middle-class mom, I deal with outrageous daycare costs, student loan debt. So electing me is electing someone that understands in a personal way, not someone that has to have a think tank come up with a report on it, these practical challenges, and can then bring, because of my professional experience, practical solutions and actually get it done.
Now, your professional experience, could you go into that a little more detail?
Certainly. Well, I mentioned that it was answering a call to serve, and so was my time in the intelligence community. I joined the intelligence community following living in New York City during the 9/11 attacks. My then girlfriend and high school sweetheart, now my wife, was in a subway train under Lower Manhattan when the towers fell. And I spent 3 hours not knowing if she had survived. She called me on a payphone about 3 hours later to let me know that she had made it.
Back then.
Yes, payphones. Yes, kids out there. It was this device that you'd go to and walk and put a coin in.
And Superman used to.
Exactly, exactly. So for me, in that time that I was waiting to see if she had made it, I bargained with God, I begged, I said, please just bring her back to me. It was also the 7th anniversary of my aforementioned father's death. Mm-hmm. So for me, I then had to honor that promise. So I spent 13 years in the intel community, and my focus, as I said, was weapons of mass destruction issues. That's stopping countries like North Korea from exporting nuclear technology and WMD-related material, missile technology, and then weapons going into conflict zones. That's places like Syria, that's going to terrorist groups, etc. And I did that for 13 years. The last about 5 of which I was a division chief, so I was running that mission, the movement of those weapons, trying to combat that by sea for the intelligence community. And it wasn't just work that was intellectually engaging and helped me figure out how to work across government to get things done, work with Department of State, Treasury, work with Congress, work under the Bush administration, the Obama administration, even the Trump administration. It also gives me such gratitude and optimism because you see Americans from all these diverse backgrounds coming together to get things done. And in my own personal case, speaking of diverse backgrounds, I happen to be a transgender woman. I transitioned while on the job, doing that job in 2006, when I had no legal protections behind me, when I could have been fired on the spot. My team, my chain of command rallied around me. And it was quiet for a long time because I was in the intelligence community, but we did it. I thrived despite some early obstacles, promoted multiple times afterwards. So that tells me that Americans really can do incredible things, and we are better people than the news and the angry voices would sometimes have us think.
Well, it's a different approach, different situation than
Yes.
Most people have to live through.
Yes.
What's your policy platform?
I have a very comprehensive policy platform. I'm proud to say that I'm the first candidate in the race to have detailed proposals on every possible subject of interest to the voters. I'm not just talking unemployment, underemployment, healthcare, opioid epidemic. I'm talking detailed proposals on education. I'm talking about combating climate change, student loan debt restructuring, all of that. So if you go to our website at alexandrachandler.com, you can see it in great detail. What I would sum it up as is I am a pragmatic progressive. My agenda across the board is about returning as much political power to working middle-class people as possible, getting money out of politics to the fullest extent we can, and then being responsible about the finances of our country. So what that means is making the wealthy and corporations pay their fair share, investing the proceeds of that both in the next generation, education, infrastructure, better health care, and then also finally getting out of, and I know this is near and dear to you, the endless cycle of deficit and debt, because that is a long-term crisis for our country, and it's our constant falling into short-term thinking and not just mortgaging off the long-term in the future that is going to eventually, the bill is going to eventually come due. And I've got two kids, a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I'm not just going to sit there and let that happen to them.
They would end up paying for it.
Yes.
Yes.
And their kids.
And they're, right. It surprises me because when my brother-in-law was running for president in 1992, and that was Paul Tsongas, he was a very a great had a great plan for keeping us out of $1 trillion debt. Now we're $21.5 trillion in debt, and I keep looking back and thinking to myself, how did that happen, and what changed that caused us to be so be such spendthrifts? I just have a problem with that. What would you like to do about? Well, this is something that comes up quite a bit. What would you like to do about underemployment?
Very good. Well, a few things. One is when I talk about underemployment, just to make clear what I'm speaking of, it's that these are people who have jobs, but they're jobs that are not at the level of skill that they possess, and they're jobs that can't provide for a family or for even a single person. So a few things. Raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour gradually so as to not be overly economically disruptive. Also, incentivize profit sharing by corporations. We have massive amount of deductions for executive compensation and a great deal of other things. Condition those deductions on corporations extending generous profit sharing programs to ordinary workers. Mm-hmm. Federal support to apprenticeships. A great deal, many states actively support apprenticeship programs with tax credits and deductions for companies that engage in them. So that then these are programs whereby even if you're a student that doesn't necessarily want to pursue a 2 or 4 year track advanced degrees, that there are jobs for the automation economy that's coming that you can prepare for with good apprenticeships. Those are a few of the things that I would propose. Okay. And then pay for them with, as I believe we've talked about previously, restoring the Clinton-era tax structure. So if people are making over $250,000 a year, those taxes would go back to those rates. And then rates that would graduate up higher for people making over $1 million a year. Everything that I propose on my website and my platform, I pay for.
Okay. And unemployment, how would you attack unemployment? Because that's, of course, a major... the Republicans are trying to say that the unemployment is not a major issue. However, I think that they're not quite right, so I'd just like to have your take on it.
Well, I agree that they're not quite right insofar as official unemployment statistics. I don't go along with those who just say that, well, we have to ignore them. What I would say, though, is that they don't capture people that are so chronically long-term unemployed that they have ceased actively looking for work, and then they fall out of the statistical tracking. So I'd say some of the very solutions that I talk to addresses that. But then on top of that, I would say my proposal for block grants to the states to encourage, you can't make this happen, but encourage no-cost community college, and not just for the sake of throwing money at this problem, but because if you do that coupled with investments in transportation and childcare for people, because a lot of these people that are falling out of the labor force, it's because getting a job will not sufficiently pay when you factor in transport and childcare. If they can get to a place where they can improve their skills, they can get a job that pays slightly more, then they will go back into the labor force. So what you have to do is have these grants not just give Middlesex or Northern Essex a ton of money. What you have to do is have budget lines that say, and your child care center, we're going to expand that. Okay, the local and regional transportation authorities, we're going to plus up service that there's actually more than one bus every 2 hours at night, so that people can actually get to courses, not during working hours, because if you are already barely making ends meet with your job, if you're underemployed or have no job, then what are you going to do in terms of taking further risk to spend money to get skills that you may or may not be able to apply? We have to make it as easy as possible for people.
It seems to be tied into your underemployment.
It is.
Stance.
It is.
Too. I have a problem with the so-called middle class tax cut. It wasn't a tax cut. It was a tax. It was a tax, and it was $1.5 trillion.
I agree.
And I just said something about Paul Tsongas being gun shy of $1 trillion debt. This one didn't even cause the president to blink.
No.
In my opinion. What do we do about paying off that debt?
Well, the Republicans in the last few cycles have been fond of the phrase repeal and replace. That's exactly what I would do with this horrible, horrible, incredibly detrimental fiscal and financial policy. We simply repeal these cuts once we, knock on wood, take control of the House. Now, granted, Trump is still the president, and his term goes till 2020 unless other things intervene. But I would seek to repeal those at the earliest possible opportunity. Then in terms of paying that off, as I mentioned previously, if my plan were enacted, we'd be going back not just to the rates that this had come down from when it comes to people making over $250,000 a year. We'd be going back to the rates basically when Paul Tsongas ran for president. So that's a 39.6% rate at $250,000 more a year. That would, in just the first year alone, raise approximately $150 billion a year in revenue. So we would, assuming we've gotten ahead of this, and it's only a year or two.
It seems like such a tiny amount given the size of the debt, though.
It is. It's only a start, because that, as I said, that is restoring the Clinton-era rates. Then what I would also do is go further and go closer to where we were in some would argue, the glory days of the middle class of this country economically. There are a lot of racial and gender equity challenges there. But when I'm talking about the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, our top marginal rates were in the 70 through 90% range, and I'm not even remotely talking about that. I'm talking about rates that go to 49% for people, those few entities that make $1 billion a year. And if you do that, we get to a place where it's not $150 billion a year roughly, it's more like 200. And granted, that still is just putting a dent in things, but it's a start. And then you work on corporate inversions and you work on other elements of corporate taxation. And then it's a matter of holding the debt where it is roughly as the economy then grows, so it becomes a lower and lower proportion of GDP over time.
I'm in education, and I understand that that's one of your favorite topics. So what do you like about the education debate?
Well, I come at it from multiple lenses, and that I am myself a parent, a mom. I've got a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. And my 5-year-old is in a behavioral public school, which so far we're very, very happy with. But I would say is that not everyone is happy with the state of their child's education, not in Massachusetts, not in the country. And opportunity is so uneven. We're lucky in the Commonwealth in that by relative terms we have some of the best schools in this country. But what I would seek to do is a few things. Betsy DeVos and this administration are doing their level best to privatize education, which I will completely resist as a member of Congress. And when I say privatize, I'm talking about taking funds from the Title I program and moving it to private charter schools to fund those schools at the expense of schools that serve vulnerable kids. And those schools happen to have a profit motive attached to them. I am not against charter schools. Charter schools are vital for experimentation to capture innovative practices that you then bring back to the public school system, which very much needs it. But I do not believe in that zero-sum game where we drain from one to give to the other. I also would really like to get the federal government to honor its decades-long commitment to fully fund special education and education for children living with disabilities, which should be funded by the federal government by statute at 40% of the cost of providing that education to kids. The federal government's failed to do that all this time, so that's yet another unfunded mandate that goes down to the local level, and then, as we've recently heard discussions of, you get problems for schools right here in Lowell, where the boiler gets busted, and then we have to figure out, okay, can we replace the part? We replace the boiler, and either way, the overall budget is going to suffer, and it's already strained because of the unfunded mandates that come down from above. So this is a way to provide concrete relief that reaches school systems all across Massachusetts. And then beyond that, universal preschool. Because if we give 4-year-olds that 1 year start before kindergarten, the investment in long-term outcomes, specifically for more vulnerable kids, where family life is unstable, they're perhaps not getting read to at home and as much parental engagement because their parents are having to work 60 hours a week to make ends meet.
Right.
If you instead have them in that environment, their long-term educational and socioeconomic outcomes improve dramatically. It's an investment that pays off. So that's something else that I'd be very much behind.
Okay. We talked a little bit about your national security background. I did want to get into it a little bit more, if we can.
Please.
Okay, so how I have a son who works for Homeland Security, and he's a manager there, and his there's a lot of stuff he can't tell me. So that always starts off the conversation on the weekends. But what is it about national security that you'd like to see defined further or changed?
For me, it's about restoring balance to our foreign policy and to our national security, such as I can as a member of the legislative branch, in that we've seen, not just this administration, but over time, so much of the prerogatives of Congress, particularly when it comes to authorizing military action, move over to the executive. So one of the things that I would want to do to address that would be to repeal the 2001 authorization for use of military force that was originally employed to go after, as I believe we absolutely had to do, the terrorists in Afghanistan that came after us in 9/11. But that justification is now being used to justify our operations in numerous places around the world. As someone who came out of the intelligence community, I know there's good reason for some of those operations, but Congress needs to have a debate about it and needs to proactively authorize those actions. And what that then goes to is we have come to a point where defense is the one-stop shop for all of our foreign policy national security solutions, whereby we see any problem in the world and the first thought is send in the 82nd Airborne or send in the U.S. Air Force. That's not been the core of the bipartisan consensus in our foreign policy for a long time. We need to reinvest in the State Department, USAID, and all of the tools of our soft and hard power, which under this administration have been under relentless attack. The Foreign Service, there are people leaving left and right at the senior ranks. So I would seek to reinvest in diplomacy and in development while still having the strongest military in the world. Just let's not go so far tilted just in that direction. And I'm someone who, in my very last job in the intel community, I worked in the Pentagon in the budget planning, programming, budgeting process. I understand how those cycles work, and I understand where we can look, particularly in terms of how we budget. We have this whole budgetary account called the Overseas Contingency Operations Account. It's been used since 9/11 to justify $1.7 trillion of spending that aren't subject to all the budgetary caps that apply to all other defense, non-defense spending. We're not being honest with the American people about how we're spending their money. And that's one thing we need to do. If we need that money, fine, then let's have the debate and program it into the defense budget directly. No more gimmicks.
Well, I have a major problem, as you know from a previous show that we did, with the debt ceiling, and the fact that we consistently have to raise the debt ceiling because we're overspending. What can you tell us about the debt ceiling and what you're doing in Congress to abate it
Yes.
a little bit?
I agree in part, in that what I would say is that I too would like to see a point where we're not just automatically hitting raise the limit, raise the limit, raise the limit, but because what we'll need to first do is to put some more revenue on the table to avoid absolutely draconian cuts to the most vulnerable. That would be a goal that I would set in a few years' time, where we don't need to be having to look at that, because I don't think that we can bring the deficit from $400 billion to zero in a single year. I would hope to achieve that in a few years with enhanced revenue, and I think that is entirely achievable when you look at what, if you examine the plan, individual income taxation that I would be looking at, repealing some of the corporate breaks, including inversions, including a whole variety of incentives to really move your operations abroad. We're talking in the $300 billion a year range. We can get there in only a few years. So I would find it to be a goal within, say, 4 years to get to a place where we're not automatically raising the debt ceiling.
I just have a problem with it. It's extremely detrimental to the budget,
I agree.
and I have a major problem with it. We talked a little bit about Keynesian economics too, and you were kind of surprised that I brought that up. But
Pleasantly.
it's in his book How to Pay for the War. John Maynard Keynes stated that he wanted to see us wage the war, pay for the war with debt, and then take the debt away by paying for the debt. And it seems to me that the people who are setting the budget now think that they are making some sort of Keynesian economic move. And in fact, I think John Maynard Keynes is probably rolling over in his grave thinking that $21.5 trillion is a debt that the United States now has.
I agree. I would say that one of the things you mentioned in that is use the debt to pay for the war. We are still, at least in the Defense Department, on a war footing.
Right.
So some of what that would entail, I would argue, would be looking to end the wars to the fullest extent that we can. We can't simply abruptly move out of our commitments, but we need to be looking at how to demilitarize them to the fullest extent possible, because to me that is a precondition, because so much of our spending is now non-discretionary. Defense needs to be on the table to a certain extent. Otherwise, we're never going to get there when it comes to the debt. So I would say that looking at DoD, looking at the balance of diplomacy and development is part of how you get to the debt.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's the way I see it.
Well, another thing that we've discontinued doing, and I think that this was discontinued during the rebuilding of the Republican Party to something a little more, a little less kind and a little more Tea Party-ish,
Yes.
is crossing the aisle.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see people crossing the aisle anymore. When President Obama put together the Obamacare, he didn't get one Republican vote. They had 700 amendments in that document, and not one of them voted for any one of their amendments. They voted specifically along party lines, and they didn't cross the aisle. How do you see crossing the aisle as a technique?
It's part of why I'm running. It's because my own past, we wouldn't have been able to succeed against any of our intelligence community, therefore our foreign policy problems, without people of different political parties working together, without working with appointees from either party. For myself, in terms of issues where I can see it, what I was just talking about in terms of the authorization use of military force, I see that as an opportunity to reach out to some of the more libertarian-minded Republicans. I think that there are other opportunities, including I have a proposal on my website for a national service program, where I think that what we see in Congress, to some extent, is a long-term symptom of a problem where we don't have members of Congress who were united in the pursuit of some existential purpose previously, whether it was fighting in World War II or whatever else, Peace Corps, other ventures. What I would like to do is offer a voluntary opportunity for every American. So AmeriCorps is just not at remotely the scale I'm talking about, but for every American when they come out of high school to volunteer for a year of service. And this can be anything from working as an EMT to our national parks to building houses in rural and urban areas. Have that opportunity, build some skill, get a portable educational benefit, and you will, as someone from Lowell, work with someone from Birmingham, Alabama, and you might be working in Texas while you're doing it. So that then that will, at least for the next generation, maybe it's somewhat too late for the rest of us, though I like to count myself in the corner as someone who does this as a habit. But for those that are coming up, to recapture some of that spirit, so that then when they're in Congress 20 years from now, they'll be doing better.
Okay. The last question, we're running out of time. The last question I have for you is on North Korea. I'm a little bothered that we have a president who states that he will annihilate North Korea and doesn't bat an eye on the issue. When in fact, if we annihilated North Korea like that, we would have to watch out for Chinese and Soviet, it's not Soviet anymore, but Russian missiles being pointed at us. What do you think of the cavalier notion that we can just bomb North Korea if that's what it comes to?
It's completely wrong. It's a completely false notion. The only constructive way out of where we find ourselves with North Korea is through a combination of diplomacy, pressure, and defense. In that North Korea has nuclear weapons and North Korea has an active missile program. We need to do everything that we can to mitigate their potential to strike the U.S. or our allies with those missiles. So that's enhancing missile defense capabilities, that's working with China quietly on an understanding that we do not seek to have an end game that is unacceptable to them, a united Korea that's a United States ally with U.S. troops on the Chinese border. And what you do is what's being done by President Trump. Every time he yells loudly about this, and every time he raises tension, he gives Kim Jong-un what he wants, which is a more of a feeling of an existential crisis between the two countries, which then allows him to justify to his own population, the United States, as a mortal threat. And also, because tensions then increase and increase, we drive up the cost for China, Russia, other powers to diplomatically come to our assistance in the issue. If we instead treated this as the problem as it is, a manageable problem, we would then not find ourselves having to make unacceptable promises to either the Chinese, the Russians, or others to come to our side. And this is where it's not just about North Korea. Everything that President Trump's doing with the Iran deal, threatening to break it, threatening to pull out of it, make unacceptable changes. What then does that do if you're North Korea? That tells you that even if you do come to an agreement with us, we're just going to pull out of it. And then that itself forecloses the future option to get out of this.
I agree. This has been Jim Peters with Peters Principles. We've had Alexandra Chandler, who is running for Congress in the 3rd Congressional District in Massachusetts. And Alexandra, thank you for being on.
Thank you so much. Anytime.